Hello, and welcome to episode 122 of Power Score LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in sun-dappled Napa Valley.
Sun-dappled. That's a good one.
That was a great day here. Beautiful temperatures, nice sun, a little bit of fall leaves. Feeling good.
I like it. Well, I apologize for dragging you back indoors a day earlier than we expected to do this so that we could record this and get it out to people.
Now, I'm glad we can, actually, because usually this comes out on Thursday, and it worked out for us that it was better to do it on Tuesday night and release it on Wednesday, so everybody gets hopefully a good surprise here.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you agreed to it. I thought you were just thirsty, and this is what it was going to take. But
also true.
Here we are. Well, don't leave them hanging. What are you drinking?
You know, I'm going for something that's a little more fall. I've had it before, but it's one of my favorite go-to drinks, especially when I'm out on the town, and that would be a Moscow Mule.
Oh, fantastic.
Although I thought to myself, should we come up with a different name? Because, Moscow, Russia, there's got to be some kind of different way to express this. But for now, I don't have an alternative name, so Moscow Mule it is.
Yeah, what's a good synonym for war crimes? I'll leave that to the listeners to chime in on. Find Dave on Twitter and suggest an alternative for Moscow Mule.
Yes, let's hear that. But I want to know what you're up to.
I've gone with something decidedly more domestic. Also fall, though. I'm headed to Nashville to see family next week, including my brother-in-law, who is a bourbon, I don't know if connoisseur is a strong enough word, a bourbon pervert or something. Like he just...
Aficionado is the word
that's probably better. So I'm trying to warm up for it. I poured myself a big glass of Jefferson's Reserve bourbon.
Oh, big glass. So I better watch out what happens towards the end of this episode.
Yeah, we better hustle.
Now, you chose the song, and I know why you chose it, and I, of course, approved it. So I'm going to let you explain what our thinking was on this.
This will be quick. We're here to talk about the November LSAT. It's halfway through November. I was trying to think of November songs. And, of course, the one that jumped immediately to mind is a good old Guns N' Roses tune from Use Your Illusion 1, I think, which is November Rain.
Cold November Rain.
Yeah, so I put very little creative energy into this.
That's okay.
On the nose.
That's a great song. You and I were talking about this beforehand. The outro on that song is insane. I absolutely love it. The last, about 2-3 minutes of that is great. But it also is apropos for me because Napa's been having November rain here, which is a fantastic thing because it means that fire season, at least in my area, has come and gone with no fires. And that's not always the case here. Yeah. So I'm really happy about that.
This felt like a pretty good year for you guys up there.
A calm year, and that's exactly what you want. Harvest went great. Fire season dissipated quickly and really never flared up at all. And for anybody in the Bay Area, at least the immediate Bay Area, that's fantastic. There were fires, and obviously that caused problems for those people. They were a little farther away, more Central California or more Northern California for me. So
that's good. Well, thank you, Dave, for adding some layers to my very superficial song choice.
I made it seem like it was actually a choice with intent. Let's get into the LSAT world and talk about what's going on there. Jon, I'll let you kick this off, too.
Sure. Well, this is a bit of old news, but probably still unfamiliar to some people who are listening, and that's about score preview. Before the October test, they changed the policy on score preview, where it wasn't any longer just for first-time test takers. Anyone was able to purchase it. It's $45 if you buy it before your test, $75 during a certain window of time after your test. And for those who don't know what score preview is, what it means is when scores are released, you get to see your score along with everyone else, and then you have the opportunity to cancel it. Essentially replace the number on your record with a candidate cancel. So schools won't see the number if you choose to do it. They'll just see that you cancel the score. For a lot of people, that's a preferable outcome. And I think psychologically, too, there's a lot to be said for this. We've talked about it in the past, so I won't elaborate too much more. But if you're interested in getting score preview, you can still get it for the November test. It's $75, but it may be worth it.
We talked about this in a prior episode, but my view of this is that if you can afford it, and that's obviously a legitimate question here and a serious concern, you should get score preview. I had the unhappy conversation with a student that I'd never talked to before, and they just wrote me out of the blue. And they were in a position where they really should have gotten score preview, just didn't think to do it. They'd already gotten their score. It was too late. This was obviously not for this test, but a prior test. And I gave them that advice. I'm like, going forward, always get it. And their response was, I wish I'd realized that beforehand.
Yeah.
It's just good to have in your pocket if something happens and you don't like it. And in this case, they actually went on to challenge their score. And I don't believe their score was changed, but it was that much of a variance that they'd encountered.
Yeah, that's surprising. Double-digit score drop. Score Preview is going to feel like it was well worth the money if that happens to you.
Yeah, they weren't a Power Score student. They were just somebody who had actually written me on Twitter asking me for advice, which I'm always happy to give.
Sure.
And in this case, there was very little I could do for them, which I never liked. But if they'd had Score Preview, we could have at least game planned what to do with that and then, wipe that away from their record. But on to the LSATs that we are dealing with.
Yeah.
Obviously, November is the test that we're kind of in the middle of. And the reason I say that is we got a makeup test coming up, I think in a week. I think that's coming up on the 22nd.
I think you're right.
They moved it to that Tuesday. Last year, as a matter of fact, for these makeups was when they started that to avoid Thanksgiving. And then keep in mind that score release for all test takers, including retesters, will come out on November 30th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time.
Yeah, that's a date we'll mention a few times, I think, as we get through this. Wednesday morning, the 30th, last day of the month, you will get your score.
Absolutely. What are the LSATs after that?
Yeah, well, after that, we get into a whole new calendar year of tests, and the first 2 months both have one. There's a January test on the 13th and 14th. The registration deadline, I think this is important to mention, is December 1st. So if you're listening to this because you took the November test, as would make some sense, you're going to have about a full day, a little over a day, from when the scores come out for this November to when you're able to sign up for January, or the cutoff for January is. So January is still very much an option, even once these scores come out.
And let me make a side comment about January, because I'm starting to see the questions come out that says, is January too late? We've also covered this on the podcast in the past, so I'm not going to reiterate the many reasons why. But we can point to multiple well-informed experts, including ourselves, who would say it is not a problem whatsoever to take January. So if you're like, wait, I need to know more about that, that is in prior episodes where we talk about that. This is not the episode for that.
Yeah, although I may put you right back on that same spot about the February test, which is the next one. There's the February test on the 10th and 11th, again, Friday and Saturday, pretty much standard. Now, the registration for that is 2 days after Christmas, December 27th, by midnight that night. It's going to come up. We don't have to do it now. I feel bad for threatening. But I would make a similar comment to January, which is I don't feel like February is alarmingly late. You're going to start to potentially run into some school deadlines. But yeah. I still feel like February is a great test to take if you feel like you've got a couple more points on the table.
Let me frame it this way. If you have a score on record and it's not going to get you into the school you want to go to, you don't really have a whole lot of choice. You either have to take the LSAT again in January or February, or you have to punt it till next year. The idea of getting lucky in admissions, somebody scoring, say, a 150 and the school they're looking at has a 25th percentile of, say, 157, you need to retake the LSAT. It doesn't matter if it's January or February. In February, you will at least have a shot. The question always comes up is, like, what's the scholarship situation? And it varies from year to year. This has been a slow cycle. That helps people who take LSATs later. This is a slower cycle than last year by about 10%. And so, and the year before that was slow as well in terms of decision making. So it's actually helping people who are waiting. If you can take January or February, I definitely recommend January because your scores come out in February, whereas your February scores aren't really appearing until the very end of the month. There is no March LSAT. So if you miss either of those two, your next opportunity is April. And now you're getting late. That kind of test is good for the following cycle or for some last-minute negotiations that you might want to do in terms of scholarships. But again, that's more than I even wanted to say on this. We've done entire episodes on the admission cycle and timing and so forth, and I just refer people back to those in a moment.
I think that's probably the best way to get through it. Although I will say it's funny how polarizing a slow cycle can be because obviously if you've already applied and you're waiting for results, it sucks. You just sit in this weird limbo, this purgatory of indecision. And you wait it out. There's nothing to do but be patient. Whereas if you're someone who maybe is going to push it to the limit with a February test, it really works in your favor. Schools haven't made the commitments that they would have in years past.
And are we seeing decisions? Absolutely.
Sure.
there's not as many decisions as you might have seen at this point in time, say a couple of years ago. So that's the difference that we have right now. But if you are taking the January, February LSAT, as always, we have free seminars that are going on constantly. The next one that's coming up is on November 29th. That is a Logic Games Circular Games webinar, one that I strongly recommend if circular games are anything that worries you. They keep reusing an LSAT, of which I designed a drill in that particular webinar that perfectly lines up with the concepts behind that particular game, at least the general setup idea of the way it works. And then, John, you and I will get together on December 8th for the January, February Crystal Ball.
That's right.
Which we are in the process of updating right now. We've got new information, making some changes to it, as we always do, primarily to keep it fresh for us. And that'll probably be about an hour and a half webinar. One change this time, no Q&A at the end. So I'm not going to just open the mic up and take questions. I may do a regular Q&A webinar at some point in December, though, and just talk about admissions. We'll have to see. I'm not promising anything.
Martyrdom. Look at you.
You know how easy it is to just open up the mic and take Q&A? It's about the easiest thing in the world.
In terms of prep for it, yeah, it's just show up.
It's one slide. Hi, please ask me questions.
Yeah. In terms of the absolute mayhem, that's
it's kind of like an office hours thing to me, and you just end up talking to people. It's fun. And then on December 13th, we go back to the very beginning of the LSAT and give a complete overview of it under our LSAT 101 webinar. But on that note, let's get into the November 2022 LSAT, talk a little bit about that exam, and then get into the sections, identify what's real and experimental, and as always, make scale predictions at the end. Yeah. So let's run it down, man.
All right. We mentioned this already. I'll just say it again. This test score release will come out on the 30th of this month, 9 a.m. Eastern. Retakers will get it at the same time. And then you've got that day and the next till midnight on the 1st to sign up for January. So that's great news. Dave, I want to talk a little bit about the numbers. We always give test stats in terms of volume day by day. You keep a really close eye on this, you saint. So if you don't mind running us through what it looked like in terms of test takers, head counts.
It was actually pretty even throughout the two main days of this test on the Friday and Saturday. Each day was around 10,000 test takers. Mm-hmm. And then on Tuesday, which is today, mm-hmm. you had a couple hundred paper and pencil test takers that are floating around. So the estimation that LSAC had on this was that they were going to end up with around 20,000 people taking it. And the registration as of this morning was 22,372. So you can see how they still lose a good percentage of people, even from the final registration numbers that we have.
About 10%, in fact.
Yeah. So, and the thing is if you compare this year to last year, this cycle from, say, July, December had 3 LSATs. This year we had 4 LSATs. So you're probably going to end up with a few thousand more tests, but you're losing an LSAT on the back half of the cycle. We don't have the March test, mm-hmm. whereas last year we did have a March test. So probably at the end of it will end up being roughly similar in terms of the total number of test takers. Right now, the total number of applicants is down about 7%, but I will say this, it has been closing very quickly. 10 days ago, it was down 14%. Now it's down 7%. Wow. Probably tomorrow, I'll put up an update on applicants, LSAT standing, and so forth, just so everybody's kind of like apprised of the situation when this comes out.
Yeah, I didn't realize it had shrunk that much. That's wild.
Mm-hmm. It's been really moving quite quickly, like a percentage point, closing the gap every single day. It's been really interesting to watch.
It is interesting to watch. We cover this typically too, which are test Proctor U issues. Did we see any kind of like widespread problems? And I feel like a broken record at this point, which is a good thing. The answer is no. I didn't see anything that was tremendously overwhelming. There were obviously some scattered issues. There always are, whether it's long wait times or disconnects or proctor confusion or whatever the case may be. And when that happens to individual people, the nature of your comrades out there is really irrelevant because it happened to you. And we feel for you. But we didn't see anything with like wholesale outages and things like we have seen in the past. So that was good news.
There was, no huge systemic issue. There was a few reports of proctors just ghosting, just disappearing entirely, which I'm like, dude, do your job. But you're exactly right. it's not a big deal until it happens to you. And then it's literally the worst possible test experience you could have. And one of the things that you see is that people who have had that impact tend to go online and talk about it because A, they're mad and they justifiably are mad. So that's not to take away from their anger. I completely understand it. If it happened to me, I would be equally angry. And also they want to share and see, what do I do? Get feedback. So a lot of times the people who have had good test experiences, which is the majority of individuals, they don't go out there and talk about it. But just keep in mind that you can always call LSAC. You can also chat with them. They do have a live chat feature. They've told me that they tend to do several hundred chats per day as they go through this process. So it is a way to kind of get some assistance. Then you also have a complaint form inside your LSAC account that you can kind of go in if you've had a real issue.
Yeah, and a makeup test next Tuesday, as we mentioned as well. So there is this safety net in place for a reason.
Yeah, and I will point this out because I've been asked about it. If you have had a minor problem, usually that does not justify a retake. You lost 30 seconds due to a proctor moving your cursor. They also won't do partial retakes. You can't keep 3 sections and then just have one section that they redo. The retake is supposed to be for major problems. So if all of a sudden you did get ghosted and you're like, I can't get back into my test, or my test didn't start, or you never even got your session going, or you got kicked out and were gone for 15 minutes, those are major issues. That's when I've seen them go ahead and allow for that retake. And just keep in mind that retake will be a completely different test than the one we're about to talk to. About.
That's exactly right. It's a full square one restart, blank slate, new test. It's basically like the first one never happened.
That's exactly right.
All right. So you know what comes now, Dave. Do you want to
my favorite, least favorite section of this? Everybody says, I'm going to fast forward this. I'm like, no. We released this podcast last time, and the very thing that I asked both first and last happened within, I think 10 minutes of it being up. And I almost wrote the person a message saying, like, really? Did you not listen? So I'll go through the requests that we have of the listeners, as well as disclaimers and explanations about how all of this works. And I'm going to go through it fast. But if you're new to this, please listen to it because there are some, I think, very salient points in here. And the first one is, please don't summarize this. Don't summarize what's real. Don't summarize what the scaling is, especially because you're going to miss the nuance, especially today, because there is some nuance to our discussion of the scaling. Last time we had some nuance, and of course, the summary I saw online completely missed it, which, burns me. Anyway, we want people to hear what we have to say directly. It's free. You can go right to the section and listen to it. It doesn't take very long. How this all works is really a matter of some degree of public knowledge. It's also a matter of us using information that we alone have. So certainly what we do when we put together this discussion of real and experimental, as well as scaling predictions, is we rely on some public information. Things that students say, things that instructors who've taken the test say. We connect back all the different pieces of information, the data points that we have, to a fairly substantial really hundreds and hundreds of records, really thousands, come to think of it, about prior test usage. Allows us to find out when it was used before, the difficulty levels that we assessed, what we know about it. And in some cases, we have an incredibly detailed level of knowledge. I'd say this test is one of those. So I'm not going to explain exactly how we do that or how we all put it together because that's the secret sauce, but we've been fortunate to be incredibly accurate over time and to be able to make really good predictions about how this all works. But more on that later. Next thing I'll point out is that your section order is irrelevant. If you had reading comp first and fourth and someone else had reading comp first and fourth, it does not mean that you had the same two sections, and it doesn't mean that even if you did have the same two sections, they were in the same order. So that is something to just be aware of. They vary the order and the section content all day long. Remember that when you're talking about this test, you are more than welcome at this point to talk about the generalities of the section, difficulty that you saw, whether or not, this game was about dog walkers or pig walkers or whatever it might actually turn out to be, dogs. So you can do that. What they don't want you to talk about is specific solutions, question types, answer choices, what the right answer, the wrong answer was, and so forth. They want you to wait until the main testing days are over. They are now over, so we can talk about this. So we're not breaking any rules. Also, when you think about how you performed on this test, just be aware that almost everybody who takes a real LSAT, because of the added layer of pressure, feels worse than if they were taking a practice test. Take a practice test, look, you don't do well, you're like, darn, but it didn't count. Here, the pressure's on. That almost always filters and colors everything in a more negative light. That negativity bias makes people feel worse about the performance. It makes them tend to think that what they just took was the hardest LSAT ever. We understand that. Just be aware of it. When we talk about harder or easier, remember that it's always relative. We think the LSAT's difficult in general. It's always tough. So if I say something's easier, it just means easier, but it's still hard. It's not the hardest of hard LSAT sections. It's an easier version, but it's still difficult. And then remember that the test makers are actively trying to confuse you. They do it all the time. You might see a topic in one reading comp passage and you start saying, yes, I had that passage. And it turns out that there were two separate passages that both revolved around that topic, even though they were different. This is an active thing that the test makers do. It can be very confusing when people are talking afterwards. That's what they want. We'll try to sort that out, and we usually point it out when we come across it. Another thing I'll point out is that our estimations of real and experimental sections are based on certain assumptions about test reusage. One of them being that prior sections that were scored are scored again and will not be used as experimental sections except in terms of some type of accident. Those accidents have happened before. We pointed out when it does occur, it's incredibly rare. Just be aware of that. It's also possible you don't hear your section discussed below, or you don't recall the questions that we mention because we don't mention all of them. That happens. Sometimes I've had students come to me and say, you didn't talk about my section. We started talking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, that's your section. You just didn't recognize those questions. People black out during this test and afterwards. There are blind spots that they have about the exam because it's a stressful experience. So don't be surprised by that. Also, information is limited, so we don't always get every data point, especially if you had a section that wasn't given to very many people. Maybe we missed it. We don't think that we did, but if we didn't hear from you, there's no way for us to know. So we blame you for that. And then last, and again, most important, please not summarize this online. I don't know how many more times I could say it, but I'm going to say it at least one more time. And on that note, John, we arrive at the discussion of the November LSAT.
Yeah, I took a bourbon shot every time he said not to summarize it. Fall out of my chair.
So I'll be talking for the rest of this.
I think you've talked enough, in fact. You've earned a Moscow Mule, a Ginger and Geneva Convention, or whatever we're going to rename it.
A Geneva Ginger?
Yeah, Geneva and Ginger. It's pretty good.
Like
let's start with the paper and pencil test, which for some people is likely still going on right now as we're recording this on a Tuesday evening. I have not heard much, if maybe anything, about the paper and pencil test today. So it's a little tough for us to specify exactly what we're about to talk about that applied to this test. But here's the good news. Unless they completely break with tradition, which I sincerely doubt, the paper and pencil test is going to be a combination of sections that we saw over the weekend. So our expectation, confident expectation, is that when we talk about content to come, you're going to be able, if you took the paper and pencil accommodated test yesterday when this comes out, you're going to be able to identify your sections based on that. If that's not the case, please let us know, and we'll see if we can maybe handle it separately. But the fact that I didn't hear from people today, you said this a second ago, I'll reiterate, it's kind of on them. We're doing this a day early for the greater good. If it misses some paper and pencil people who just were silent.
Yeah, I didn't have any students taking paper and pencil this time. Obviously, there are several hundred who did that. Yeah. Usually it is the same test as some version of the weekend. If it wasn't, just let us know, and we'll handle it differently. Let's get to the domestic Friday and Saturday test that we know of for sure.
All right. You know, we did this with October, and given that it's really the same set of content, I think we should do it again. And by content, what I mean is let's talk about the Crystal Ball webinar that we released specifically for these two tests, October and November. We mentioned that one of the tests that we predicted was used in October. It was July 2019, and we talked about some of the novelty, the oddities, really, about that test. So, how did we do this time? And I'll start, before I get into the test predictions, I'll start with the problem sets, because once again, we got a lot of really complimentary, grateful feedback from people, which is lovely. A lot of kind words. It seemed that, again, the problem sets that we recommended seemed very, very similar. In fact, a couple of people even called games that they saw on the test by games in the problem set, which is about as good a thing as I think we could do.
Yeah, and I saw that too.
Yeah.
And one of the things I will point out is the past is prologue. They repeat ideas. This is why we can say, well, we have a feeling they're going to use this test, and then we know games that might be similar to some of the content on that. This is what test preparation is. So it's not unfair. It's only sad if somebody missed it because we did it for free.
Yeah, it feels unfair for the people who didn't access it, but we made this one free, and then we made it public, which was very unusual. So again, I feel very...
People miss opportunities all the time through not paying attention. So
Yes,
I can't do... There's not much more I can do about it.
So let's talk about the test itself. We predicted a couple for October and November. One of them got scooped up by October. There were a few lingering, and the main test candidate used Friday and repeated throughout the weekend, drumroll, was exactly the full version of one of the tests that we predicted. Should I say which test it was? Or should I?
Well, we're about to anyway, so you might as well say it was February 2021.
I was about to say it was February 2020.
Jump in on you.
Nice.
Stole your thunder.
Nah, I'll take it. But that's exactly right. The test that they started the weekend off with, and again, continued to reuse on Saturday, and I think very likely may have used today for the paper and pencil, because it has a bit of history to it already, was in fact the February 2021 LSAT. That was one of the ones that you highlighted, circled, you put all kinds of embellishments on with the test preview section of the last crystal ball. You're like, guys, this is the one we think they're going to use coming up. They didn't in October, but they did here. So vindication.
Yeah, and obviously we had a podcast recap of that test so people could go and check out beforehand. If you want to do your due diligence on it, you could have been prepared in a higher degree. Whether or not, a large majority of people did that, that's, on them, not us. But it was there for the taking.
I heard from a couple of our students, and I don't know if this is necessarily unique to them, but it is who I heard from, that they had listened to that podcast, and they recognized in particular a couple of the reading comp passages that we're about to see.
And by the way, it didn't tell you what the answers were, but it's a comfort factor. Oh, yeah, this is the test. All right, I know something about this, and that sometimes just the littlest things can turn the entire experience for you. Small advantages here and there can add up to huge positive results.
Yeah, it's nice too after the fact to know, like, well, that was scored in February 21. I listened to the podcast about it. I recognize it. I just had it. It was scored for me. You're not allowed to share that information online publicly, of course, but for the individual, that's a great comfort as well.
Yeah, and I'll just remind everybody, we'll do that crystal ball again on December 8th for January and February. There's going to come a time when we don't do them. When we can't make the predictions that we feel are valuable, we will stop doing it. Right now, we still can. Right now, we're doing something that I've said before. I'm still stunned and amazed, maybe shocked that we are able to do it. I was amazed the first time we did it. I was like, that'll never happen again. I think I told you, I was like, this is a once in a lifetime achievement. Kind of like that Academy Award and Lifetime Achievement Award. And now it keeps happening. It's like winning Best Picture at the Oscars like 5 out of 7 years or 8 out of 10.
Eight in a row.
It's not going to happen for the same director. Right now we're in a roll, so I'll take it while we have it. Let's just enjoy it. This is our time. We'll see how the future goes.
Love it. Let's talk about content then. You want to start with games? I think we should.
I'll let you start with the games, and then I'll do some reading comp.
Oh boy, I'm getting all the light lifting today. Thank you. In particular, I say light lifting for games because for the first time ever, perhaps, there was not a single section of experimental logic games used.
It's happened before, but it has only happened very rarely.
Okay. You're a better historian of this than I am. I cannot recall a time where there was a section that was just completely unused for experimental.
I can only recall one, but that's one.
Yeah, well, now I can recall one because a few days ago, what we saw with logic games is 2 scored sections, no experimental sections. And before I get into the content, this makes a degree of sense. We know, in fact, next month they're beginning to test some different logic games, analytical reasoning items for future adjustments to the test. Distant future adjustments to the test. This is nothing for people in the spring to worry about. You may elaborate on that at some point again, Dave. But we know that test changes are coming to this section. So it feels like they're just kind of cleaning out the closets or the cupboards or whatever when it comes to what they have and not trying to necessarily explore a whole lot of the same stuff for the future. That's my take.
Yeah, concept. I think you're right on that. We think it's coming. We know there's a field study in December that we've recommended everybody take. That is for analytical reasoning, which is what we call logic games. right now. So it looks like they're exploring some different forms. But that means that they weren't using experimentals with this, which would make sense. If you're about to make a change in, say, 2024, you don't need any further, sections. You probably have enough. So why experiment on them? Spend it all on RC and LR.
Yeah, why invest in a longer runway? So that seems to be the case. Will this continue in January and February? No idea. But this is what we got in November. 2 scored sections. Here's what we saw first thing Friday morning. 23 questions. And this was a section from that February 2021 exam. There was a game in there about political candidate bus route or bus stops, 7 stops as this person was traveling around. A game about senior employees or supervisors training junior employees over 4 days. There was a game about a graphic designer's art portfolio, how that was organized. And then a game, I believe the last game, about 7 waiters or servers at 2 intermissions of a game where 5 served and then 5 served again.
Yeah, and it's funny, I hear that and I'm like, hey, I recognize that. Oh, yeah, I do.
Yes, you do.
From February 2021. It wasn't that long ago that we talked about this exact section. And I think, wasn't it the case that probably the third game was the hardest on that?
Most people complained about the graphic designer.
Yeah.
If that's the case.
All right. So
a rare feather in my cap here, by the way. I think I was the first one to spot this for once on Friday morning.
Yeah, I was. People wouldn't know this. I was slow out of the gate because they turned the power off at my house for 8 hours. I was like, no, and I had some other things going. I actually had a really important.
You were otherwise occupied too.
From about 7 to 8, and then at 9 a.m. the power just went off cold, and I was like, I have other ways of getting online, but you were much more adept on Friday than I was at identifying.
I was just able to pay attention. You're usually up with the roosters, and you always scoop me. You always are the first one to.
No, you were way ahead of me.
To get it, but I got this one. So go me. That was not the only section of games that we saw. There was a second set. We didn't see these until Saturday. So there was one set used all Friday and another, for the most part, used Saturday. 23 questions. These appear to be new. And it were these 4 games. There was a campground with 3 activities or facilities: picnic, recreation, and tenting. There was a game about musicians' positions in a photo. My favorite game from this set, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only one, 9 dogs to 3 dog walkers, perhaps taking them to different locations. I'll mention that one of the dogs, I promised someone I would say this, one of the dogs in that game was Pickles, and it triggered a particular test taker on Reddit whose dog Pickles had recently apparently passed away.
Jeez.
So
harsh.
It's just, how unlucky. But R.I.P. Pickles, you're a good boy.
I was going to make comment about dogs' names, and now I can't.
Sorry to introduce a somber note just then. But yeah.
It's a bummer.
That was also the hardest game in the section, not for the PTSD, but just the difficulty of it. And then finally, a game about 6, and there was some confusion whether it was books or plays, but written, created in the years 1701 to 1703.
And both of those were real.
Yes.
So then that means that everybody's getting one logic game section. If there were double logic game sections out there, I wasn't able to identify anybody who had that. We didn't hear from anybody who had that. If you were a person out there, then we don't think exists, and you do exist, come talk to us. We'd be interested in hearing from you. But that's logic games. So everyone, to our knowledge, had one or the other of those sections. And we'll talk about the scaling of those two in a little bit. But that was never the problem in this test. It was never logic games. A lot of what I heard people talking about was reading comprehension.
Yeah.
So let's go through some of that. John, no, I'm kidding.
No, I'll do it.
Like every single time I'll be like, John, how about you take it away?
I need a sip. Come here, Jefferson.
And I'll just be done.
The reason that we're hemming and hawing here and passing the buck is that there was a lot of reading comp.
There's a lot of this stuff. And then I figure I'll let you roll into LR,
All right.
Close it out, because there's plenty of that too. Let's see if I can get my arms around everything that was happening with reading comprehension, because there were at least 3 separate real sections that were in use and at least 2 separate experimental sections that were in use, which tells you they're testing out a lot of different items and forms of reading comp because they expect that to be on the test going forward. Let's start off with what we saw Friday morning, which was from that February 2021 LSAT, 27 questions. A tough section overall. The very first passage was about Frances Harper and women's suffrage. We had another passage about ancient astronomy. how accurate it was and that it formed the basis for astrology. There was another passage that was comparative about aesthetic knowledge and judgments and how that relates to testimony. And then finally, a passage about alternatives to modern copyright. And I think the author was basically get rid of copyright, but they wanted shorter duration, a distinction between the various types of mediums. As somebody who is very interested in intellectual property and copyrights and holds some, I would love to read that passage. But not an easy section, but that was real. So if you had that as one of your 2 sections, that was the scored section.
Yeah.
Let's go to another real section. We started to see more midday to late day on Friday. Also 27 questions. This appears to be a new section in terms of the usage, although some of the pieces of it have appeared previously. One of the passages about Vermeer's daughter, Maria, and whether she's a model and possibly even the painter of some famous of the works like that girl with the pearl earring. And a passage about accidental plagiarism, which I guess is known as cryptomencia.
It's when you hear something in passing and don't realize that it's lodged into your brain. So it feels original when it comes back out.
Seems like you could get a lot of music created that way.
Ask Pharrell.
Or Coldplay. And Canadian government views. Don't get me started on Coldplay. Corporate executive, moral, and social responsibility was the comparative passage. And then probably the hardest passage of this section about Indian and Hindu astronomy's accuracy and Greek influence. And notice how here's another astronomy passage, just like the one that we saw on the February 2021. These were different passages. That Indian Hindu astronomy also appeared before as an experimental back in October of 2019. Which is how we were able to make some determinations here. We knew we'd seen some of this stuff before. Yeah. This is an interesting section. Not the easiest section, not the hardest section, in my opinion. But it was, in fact, real. Mm-hmm. And then the third of the real passages, we saw this a lot on Saturday. And this was also had elements of it that had previously been used in October of 2019. And I remembered this very clearly when I heard it. For 2 reasons. And the first one was that one of the passages was on the Watts Towers by Rhodia in Los Angeles, and comes some comparisons to jazz. And I'm familiar with the Watts Towers, having lived in LA for so long, so I remembered hearing about that before I was able to go find it. And it's interesting to watch how people have described this passage differently over the years, because initially Watts wasn't clear to us, but the jazz creativity portion did actually allow us to connect this to some prior descriptions. There was another one that, for both you and I, resonated. It was about West African rice farming and the impact on South Carolina. Mm-hmm. Since you and I both lived in South Carolina in the past, Charleston specifically, and rice is a big-time deal in South Carolina. I remembered this one as well. You had another one on civil lawsuits and settlements. I've been through those before, so that would be interesting to read. You have another one on parallel discoveries in science, about how they might have been alone in the past, but they occur in groups now. And that was the comparative passage. That was a real section as well. I don't think that's going to go down as the hardest section of all time, though. So just forewarning when we get to that scaling on it. Yeah. So each of those 3 sections would be real. They would be scored if you had them. There's at least 2 other experimental sections, which I'll just briefly run through. One of the sections was one that a lot of people thought was pretty easy. It occurred on Friday a lot with the Vermeer moral and social responsibility, accidental plagiarism section. Mm-hmm. And this was a passage that included the following 4 passages. Sunken canoes, kind of like off the coast of Bronze Age, Eastern England or in the land. Elk poison and why they died and theories as to why. Comparing books on Chinese revolutionary Beijing, and then risk and precautionary principles and conservativeness, which was the comparative passage. A lot of people thought that was the easier of the 2. I'm sad to say that was not the scored section. We feel very strongly. In fact, we've identified that as experimental. We have yet to be wrong in identification. Yeah, we've never been wrong on it. So, and then the other experimental section, which we saw a lot with the Watts Towers passage, not always, but a lot, dealt with whale sonar calls, kind of the pitch and how it changes and conservation efforts and so forth. The doctrine of spite. I know I want to read that for sure. Whenever it comes out. I'm really into all the legal passages. But it dealt with spite and property law and ideas of malice and intentionality and so forth. Manufacturers and ridiculously mini kitchen planning sets in these 1950s post-war homes.
Mhm.
It actually sounds pretty entertaining to me. And then you got to love this one, Jon. Death metal.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is the best passage on the whole weekend.
The whole section sounds great to me. Spite, death metal, and then mini kitchen sets and whales. I'm like, it is really all over the place. So a lot of times we saw this paired with Watts, and a lot of people felt this was slightly harder than the Watts Towers sections. Whether or not that matters at this point is irrelevant because this was not a scored section. But that death metal passage, by the way, was the comparative on that test. And that's your 5 sections, the first 3 being real. Those last 2, if you're thinking, wait, did that count or not? They did not count. So sunken canoes, elk, the Chinese Revolutionary, and risk did not count. And then whales, sonar calls, doctrine of spite, and death metal did not count.
Yeah, we got a little bit of some fortunate breaks here because sometimes in the past, for instance, we did this with logic games, I think on the last test, where the prior use as experimental was really what clued us into the fact that it was scored this time, and we were right. Here, though, all 3 of those real sections of logical reasoning, Jesus, Jon, put the bourbon down. All 3 scored sections of reading comp we actually did see appear individually with experimental logical reasoning attached, is what I was trying to say. So we know with absolute certainty in this case that those 3 sets were real, and that the other 2 that you mentioned, the canoes and the sonar calls and the death metal in Angola, that those were experimental.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We were able to independently confirm that they had to be real. So that takes us to logical reasoning as, the final group. And Jon, I'll let you talk about that one.
Yeah, because I'm talking so well.
You talk good.
I talk good. So what we're going to do for logical reasoning, slightly different than what we just did with reading comp, is we're going to ignore the experimental sections. They're too poorly reported by most people, frankly, and they're too, frankly, just hard to pin down, and they don't matter, happily. So instead what I'll do is I'll talk to you about the 3 sections of logical reasoning that we can confirm were scored. And there were 3, there could have been more, but we know for sure of 3 different sections of scored logical reasoning. The first that we saw started Friday morning, and it was also from that February 2021 test. 26 questions, it seems, in this, although don't use question counts, use topics. These were the topics. It was a question about chickadee calls with hawks, high and low pitch calls from birds to avoid predators. There was a question in there that a lot of people were talking about, comparing anti-smoking ads, I think with cancer, to other health strategies. Another question in there about advertisements, in this case, ad executives, and ads being morally wrong because they're very influential. They're influencing behavior. There's a question about rain on one mountain, I believe it was Mount Holly, and then snow on a different mountain predicting what would happen, I think rain on a third. Question about vehicles being converted to electric and that would produce less carbon monoxide, and that still wasn't somehow a good thing. And then another question I saw a lot of comments about was one most people just called good doctors. But specifically, it was about good doctors being good diagnosticians. And if I can say diagnosticians, I think I'm back in the saddle.
You're back.
Redemption. So that was one section, obviously a lot more questions in it than what we just mentioned. But if you can identify even 1 or 2 of those, you know that section was scored for you. Moving on, there was another real section of logical reasoning. I didn't see any instance of this, Dave, until Saturday morning. I believe it had 25 questions in it. These were the topics. There was a survey indicating that telemarketing is effective, people responding essentially as a percentage as to how they reacted to a telemarketing campaign. A question that a lot of people's attention got caught by dealt with a similar thing that we've seen from reading comp, which was aesthetics, aesthetic judgment. So that was a passage that was real in reading comp. It was also a question in logical reasoning that was real. There was a question in the same section about rain during a bicycle race, wet roads, upper and lower tenants, and who pays utilities for various things in a building, a new freeway being built to reduce traffic to some suburb, and traffic actually increased. I'll put a note on that question briefly. Someone said to me that it was the same stimulus as an LR question on PT 78, specifically LR1 question 17, but a different question stem and different answers. We know they do this sometimes. I can't confirm that it's the same, but it's not unthinkable.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly about the question stem. I know the answers were different. Remember that a lot of times Logical reasoning questions are produced from years ago, at least, as part of a 2-question stimuli. Well, they don't like to lose questions, and we know there's a dearth of questions that they're dealing with. So maybe they put the first question on a test, and then several years later they use the second question, but they still revolve around the same stimulus. That's how that can actually happen. We can't go into the specifics of it further than that, other than to say, yeah, it looks like they probably split the 2 parts of it into 2 different tests years apart. But if you were doing practice tests, and this is one great reason you should do all of them, maybe you'll get lucky. Remember that it can happen. Several of the people I spoke to about this were thrown off by it because they're like, something's wrong. I've seen this before. I'm like, proceed as normal. Ignore everything. Just continue on.
Yeah, live in the moment. Forget the topic, whether it's the name of your deceased dog or a question you've seen before. A bit of trivia, we saw them do this with a very famous question from September 2018 about fairy circles. I can't remember if that was September or October, but this has happened in the last test or 2, in fact. So far from unprecedented. Moving on, this same section. So, freeway being built to reduce traffic. Night or nightlife as a frontier. A lot of people talked about that. And then a question about beta-carotene, this vitamin, correlation with better health, supplements versus vegetables. All of those were in the same section as one another. I believe 25 questions. All of those were real.
Yeah, I heard a lot of people talking about telemarketing, which is the way, I kind of identified that section mentally. That's the one with the telemarketing question. And so the first one to me was about good doctors. This one was about telemarketing. Now we get to the last section, which has another question.
I think I know which one you're going to say.
Let's play a game. Which one do you think it is?
I think you're going to say milk and cheese. But you're going to say songbirds.
Yeah. I'll let you cover it now.
Minor spoiler. The third real section of logical reasoning. I saw this one also start cropping up Saturday morning. Another 25 question section, but go again based on topics, which were these. It was a question about sour milk and the formation of cheese. Not Dave's favorite, apparently. It was a question about male songbirds and the color of them and their nesting habits. Certain brightly colored songbirds don't seek shelter when building nests. Question a lot of people talked about as well about fossil fuel power plants and new technology was going to lead to efficiency and energy savings. Question I'd like to see about chimps and baboons, arboreal primates, technically, forming alliances within their groups. Mayors are better at keeping elected officials or something accountable than the voting public is. So appointed officials versus elected officials and accountability. And then finally, a question I'd also like to see about the youths becoming more libertarian in their views.
Youths?
Yeah. But all of those, again, same section, all real. So if you can recognize any of the topics we just mentioned, whatever section they were a part of for you, that section was scored in logical reasoning.
I wonder what the percentage of people listening who get that Utes reference. It's a lawyerly reference if you know the right movie.
The Utes. There you go. You leave them hanging to go look it up?
It's My Cousin Vinny, if you are not familiar with it, which is a pretty good movie considering I'm not the biggest Joe Pesci fan. I like him when he's a mafioso, but it's overall pretty entertaining.
Well, Marissa Tomei is a delight.
She is awesome.
So there you go. That, I think, wraps it up. 2 scored sections of games, 3 scored sections of reading comp, 3 scored sections of logical reasoning for 18 total test combinations that they could have used.
Why so many compared to what we've seen earlier this year? More test takers. Mm-hmm. You get into the 20,000s, they start upping it. However, one of the things you might notice, especially if you're a long-term listener who've gone back through a bunch of test recaps, is it's really come down from what it was at the very beginning. When they first launched these online tests, they had 36, 48, sometimes over 50 combinations. Yeah. And they did that because they were very scared about test security. Burned a lot of sections, wasn't a great thing for them. But they did that because they were like, we don't want people to be able to cheat on this. And, we'd said repeatedly, there's so much content here, there's no way anyone could cheat even if there was half of it. And that's kind of what we've gone down to, is maybe a third of what we had before. This is still a lot of test sections overall. So we reached this point, and obviously what we want to talk about now is hopefully going through this, you were able to clearly identify for yourself what was real for you. We're very confident that everything that we just talked about is 100% correct in terms of being real. Again, there could be sections that maybe a few people had or that were rarely used that we haven't heard, but none of that will change what we just talked about. Let's talk about the scaling. And one of the questions we always get, Jon, is, well, how accurate are your predictions in terms of the scaling? And I think, it's really nice because they just released PT 93. And I know you have a view about how close our scaling was to, the prediction that we made to the reality that was delivered.
Yeah, this was one of the first things we both checked when that test came out, is we went and looked right at the scoring scale and compared it to the prediction we had made. Our prediction for PT 93, or at least the 3 sections that were scored on it, was we said that they were going to add up to a -8 curve for a 170. What's interesting about 93 is that a 170 wasn't available. It wasn't a score you could actually get. And this happens sometimes at the upper and lower ranges of the bell curve. There just aren't enough people and isn't enough differentiation between certain numbers. So what you could get on PT 93 was a 169 and then a 171. The 171 then becomes our kind of marker. And that was, in fact, exactly what we said. It was a -8.
Yeah, and you couldn't get 170.
Yeah, exactly.
So, as I've said, when you've talked about this before, I feel like we came as close as you humanly could come. In fact, you couldn't really come closer. So, the reason we mention that is we always get asked, like, well, how accurate is it? What's your track record? Our track record is really good. Usually when we've been off, it's by a question at most. And here, I don't even consider that to be off by a question. So it's just something to think about, as we are able to make a pretty good assessment. And the reason we do that is because we are assessing high-level difficulty. This is why when we talk about these scalings, they are related to the score of 170. It is much easier for us to assess a score of 170 because we can see the high-level difficulty more easily than, say, at 160 or 150. There, the nuances and difficulty are harder for us to see inside these discussions and what we know about this test. So just keep that in mind. That's why we use 170. So let's talk about how this actually works. When we look at how many questions you need to get a 170, we talk about it in terms of how many you can miss. So we always start at you can miss 7 questions. And then what we do is we talk about each section and we say that either it will tighten the scale, so it would move it from 7 to 6, it will have no effect, it would keep it at 7, or it will loosen it, go from 7 to 8. Harder sections loosen it. Easier, relatively speaking, sections would tighten it up. One of the things that we always say is that we are conservative. This played into how our PT 93 prediction was accurate. We'd rather go conservative because that will mean that if somebody uses our predictions to make decisions about how they think they did, they're more likely to either hit that mark or have a higher score as opposed to the reverse. And we don't like unhappy surprises on scoring day. So as we take a look at this, let's start with logic games. And again, you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. Let's go through that first section from February 2021 about bus stops, senior and junior employees, the art portfolio, and the intermission of the servers. So this was probably a medium difficulty section. When we talked about this before, we did not have it moving the scale. Nothing has changed in the interim. That has no effect on the scale. So it doesn't make it tighter. It doesn't make it looser. It keeps you at -7. Let's go to that Saturday, and I call it Saturday because it was primarily, but there will be some Friday users. This was the one about campground facilities, musicians, photos, the dog walkers, Pickles, unfortunately, RIP, and then years 1701 to 1703. I think this was harder. Do I think at the 170 level it moves it an entire point? No, I'm sorry to say that. At the 160 and moving down scale, I would say that it does. So we're not saying the section isn't harder or hard. We're just saying at the elite 170 level where you're supposed to be great at everything and you don't have that much room to miss, we don't think it moves the scale. It will have a greater effect going down from there. So we're not ignoring the fact that it is harder. So we kind of call that a 0.5 in terms of the difficulty there. So you'd move really from 7 to 7.5 is the way we would actually see that. Let's go on to reading comprehension. So everyone had one of those 2 logic games. You're either at 7 or really 7.5, although I consider that 7 still. Let's go to RC. Start off with that first passage that we saw from February 2021. That was women's suffrage, ancient astronomy, the aesthetics and copyrights. This passage, when we talked about it before, we had it loosening the scale. We still do. We think it's a hard section. So if you are at 7, you now move to -8. You can miss an additional question to get a 170. Go on to the next section that was real, the Vermeer, plagiarism, executive responsibility, the other astronomy, one about Hindu and Greek astronomy. This is very much like the logic game section we talked about. It's neither the hardest nor the easiest. It probably moves the scale when you're down lower in the scoring scale, but at the 170 level, it's not going to move it. It's more like that 0.5 kind of idea that's floating around. So if you're looking at a score and you're thinking, I'm trying to hit a 160, and you had the dog walkers and now the Hindu and Greek astronomy and Vermeer, yeah, your scale's moving for you. At the 170 level, it might add up to move it by 1 because both of them are harder than, say, medium. Again, this is the nuance. Mm-hmm. This is why we don't want people to summarize this online. Jon, take a shot.
Just thinking that exact thing.
All right. And so then the last of the reading comprehensions was the Watts Towers, rice farming in South Carolina, civil lawsuit, science discoveries. This does not move the scale. So if you had logic games that was, say, bus stops and art portfolio, and then you had Watts Towers and rice farming, you're still at -7. You have not moved 1 iota. But if you had, say, that women's suffrage passage, then it would have moved from 7 to 8. And if you had combinations of the others, it's going to really depend on what happens. 170 is not moving so much, but 160, 150 might be moving more. Let's get to logical reasoning, which in this case, we didn't see anything that was ultra difficult or necessarily easy that would loosen or tighten the scale. Remember what happens in logical reasoning. There's always a couple of really tough ones. Mm-hmm. That's just standard. In fact, having several really tough LR means that the section is normal. That makes it a medium section. So if somebody's like, man, that question was super hard. One question is not going to change the logical reasoning section. You'd need a repeated set that is out there. So let's take a look at it. The section that was about chickadee calls, smoking ads, mountain rain, good doctors and their diagnostician abilities.
See, it's harder than it looks. Vehicle.
All right. Yeah, I stumbled over it because you did, and then I was thinking about it. You couldn't say it, so then I couldn't say it.
I'm still hung up on cryptonesia. So.
Well, I just stopped in the middle of cryptonesia. This did not have an effect on the scale. Same thing is true for the telemarketing, aesthetics, bike race, new freeway to the suburbs, night is the frontier. Also, 0 effect on the scale. And also for that last passage about male, or that last LR that was scored about male songbirds, milk and cheese, fossil fuel power plants, chimps and baboons, and then libertarians. That does not have an effect. So you're going to see a lot of people in here who are really 7 and 8 able to miss with some nuance on those two that I talked about, the one in logic games and the one in reading comprehension. You're not going to see something that's like you can miss 10 questions. Is there a combination in here where you might be able to get to 9? I think you could get to like 8.5 and borderline it, but not a true 9.
Yeah,
that's it.
9 seems like a stretch for what we saw here. 8,
this was a fair test.
Yeah, I think if you had the Dog Walkers games and the Vermeer reading comp, I think you're an 8. That's my opinion. And you were probably a little less convinced at a 170. Which is fair, too. This is me being slightly less conservative, perhaps, than normal.
We talked about this beforehand, whether or not, in the ultimate analysis, it would be a full point that it would move it. And we decided to go slightly conservative. Mm-hmm. I think our initial assessment was, this might very well make it loose. So if you're sitting there thinking, no way, I know for sure that it did, go with what your opinion is. I'm not trying to change your mind on it. We had a debate over it. We have said, though, repeatedly, given the opportunity to be conservative in making the judgment here, we will be conservative because it helps people in being accurate with their estimates and gives them a happy surprise, not an unhappy one. And I'm all about happiness.
People have asked us before, and we've occasionally obliged to give predictions for scaling further down the scale, 165, 160 on down to 150 or so. I think there's too many combinations of things to try to really do that here. We ran into the same issue really back in October when they used this much content It's just tough to consider every single arrangement. So what I would say,
number after number.
Yeah, it really does become that. What I would say instead is this: this new PT93 that got released with its -8 for 171, and PT91 with a -7 for 170, the tightest of the recent tests that we've seen. I think those two are going to serve as a pretty good analog, basically, for this. I think if you look at the scoring scales for 91 and 93, and take the average, let's call it, I think you'll have a pretty close representation of what a 165 or 155 is going to look like this time.
That's perfect. And those are online. LSAC has them on their website in a weird little area called Zendesk.
Zendesk.
Or at least, that's the little subdomain that they have it on. So hopefully, this was useful. As we said before, the crystal balls that we talked about here turned out to be very accurate in terms of the predictions of what they would actually use. That's what we use to make our problem sets. It's a happy circle, especially when it's working really well. So if you are taking the January, February LSAT, we absolutely invite you to join us on December the 8th. It is free. You can sign up online at powerscore.com/free seminars. Won't cost you a thing, and you can attend. And it'll run probably 75 to 90 minutes, but we will cover all the options in terms of what we think we'll see on the January and February test. We'll make new problem set recommendations based upon the calculations that we're doing right now, and talk about what options they have from a test usability standpoint. The last thing I'll remind everybody is, please do not summarize this online.
I've got one sip left.
John, take a shot.
That's perfect.
There's a lot of nuance in this one. And if I see it, I swear I'm going to message that person and be like, I asked, come on, stop it.
I feel like you did that last one just for me. Thank you.
I knew it was there. I was like, I wonder how much he has left to drink. But we really do want people to hear what we have to say directly. It's part of the fun of doing this. And it allows us to kind of really convey our sense of what we're seeing, as opposed to just a really kind of cold distillation of it, and often inaccurate distillation, in my opinion. Any final words, John?
Last test of the year. So there you go. We get December off. Off in enormous air quotes, because we'll be doing plenty of other stuff. But
well, there's the field study, there's the crystal ball, there'll be more podcasts. I think you'll probably see us here with the Thanksgiving break. You'll probably see us again in about 2 weeks or so.
Yeah.
In terms of another episode, and then that'll be right before the crystal ball is coming online, probably a few days before that. So that's what our schedule is.
Yeah.
Obviously, we'll be around for score release when it comes out on November 30th, answering questions, helping people out. We hope this was great news for everybody in terms of what was scored and what was not scored. And as always, if this was helpful, please send us a message. It's always good to know that we're having a positive impact.
Yeah, and as the last test of the year, my final chance to say this, keep us posted on score release. We're not, again, we're not immune to good news. We're invested in this. We really want to hear how things went. And if it's not good news, you can still let us know that too.
Yeah.
We're not immune to good news. We're not allergic to bad news.
Here.
So but do keep us in the loop. We're happy to hear updates, and we're happy to give advice as needed. So just because the test is over, don't be strangers. We want to hear from you.
Yeah. And those of you who had problems, make sure that you work it out with LSAC and let us know if you have any further issues there. I've given a lot of people advice on what to do, how to approach them, the proper pathways of navigating that, and we want to make sure that everybody gets a fair test experience. That is our entire goal. Whether you're a PowerScore student or not, we want to help you. So that's something to keep in mind. And, John, I'll wish you Thanksgiving happiness in advance. Enjoy your trip to Nashville.
Thank you. Give the girls a hug from me.
I will. We'll be staying here in Napa Valley. There's no reason to leave. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment or rating as well. And if you have questions, maybe we'll do a mailbag in early December here. You can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this helped. We hope you had a great November LSAT testing experience, and we hope your scores come out on the 30th and they're everything that you wish them to be. Thanks so much, and stay safe out there.